When I was in graduate school, I rented an upstairs duplex. It was actually a really nice place. The property was super clean and well kept. All of the utilities worked, and most importantly, the place was perfectly located just 2 blocks off of campus. I could walk to any building on campus in less than 15 minutes. I could also walk to all the best bars in less than 10 minutes. For a grad student under stress due to projects and deadlines, this was a big selling point. I lived in that duplex for 2 years. When I first signed the lease, I met a really sweet elderly couple who owned the place, Bill and Janice Langford. They had been retired for several years. Bill told me that at one time he owned several rentals around town, which he rented mostly to college students like myself. But as he got older, he downsized and sold everything. The only property he had left was this duplex. Bill and Janice lived downstairs. Their only son, James, used to live upstairs, but after he got married, he took a job in the big city and left town. After that, Bill decided to rent the upstairs unit. Bill and I talked for a while, getting to know one another, and it was obvious that Bill liked me, and he trusted that I would be a good tenant. I liked the old guy too. We agreed to a 1-year lease. The first year was great. Bill was responsive to any needs that I had. I paid rent early every month, and I rarely ever had guests over who would bother them. It only made sense for me to renew the lease as I went into my second year of grad school. So we did. In my second year of living in that duplex, right before I was to leave for Thanksgiving, Bill died. Thanksgiving was on a Thursday like usual. My flight was supposed to leave on a Tuesday morning. On Monday night, as I was watching TV, I noticed there were flashing red and blue lights. Then I heard a commotion downstairs. When I looked outside, sure enough, there was a fire truck, an ambulance, a couple of police cars, and they were all parked in front of my place. I threw on a hoodie and I went outside. As I stood there dumbfounded, they wheeled old Bill out on a gurney. Janice followed in tears. I stopped her and asked her what happened. Janice gathered herself just enough to tell me that Bill had a heart attack and he had collapsed. Even though Bill was old, he was sturdy and he was still very active. I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise that this sort of thing can happen, but I was still surprised nonetheless. I asked Janice if there was anything I could do. She thanked me and said no. She said she already called her son. The next morning I flew out for Thanksgiving. When I returned to school on Monday after Thanksgiving, I found out that Bill had indeed died. Janice was a mess, obviously, but her son James and her daughter-in-law were with her. They ended up staying for a couple of weeks, just to make sure she was okay. I happened to bump into James one day before he left town. He told me that his mother didn't want to leave the house, so I could stay there and keep paying rent like usual. He said he would come by and check on things whenever he could. He gave me his direct number and told me to call him if there was a problem. This was long before cell phones, so James ended up giving me his house number. After James left, I knocked on Janice's door. She looked like she hadn't slept much. I extended my condolences and I gave her a big hug. Being polite, I told her, let me know if you need help with anything. She managed a weak smile and she thanked me. After that, I barely ever saw Janice for a while, and when I did, things just progressively got weirder. At first, it was just the stairs. To enter the upstairs unit that I lived in, Bill built a wooden deck years ago. It was still sturdy, but it creaked loudly. As long as I didn't have my headphones on, or I wasn't asleep, I always knew when someone was visiting me. Usually, it was only Bill who came up and down those stairs to do maintenance work or to take care of something that I needed. The first time that it happened, I was sitting on my couch, reading a textbook. Suddenly, I heard the familiar creaking of the wooden steps. I set my book down, and I waited for a knock on the door. I thought perhaps Janice needed something. I waited, and waited, and I realized that I was holding my breath. Then I waited some more, but no knock ever came. I got up and I went to the door. I opened it and I found no one. It was very odd. Several days later, it happened again. As I sat on my sofa, the stairs began to creak, like someone was ascending them. No knock ever came at the door. After opening the door and seeing that no one was there, I went downstairs and I knocked on Janice's door. After about a minute, she opened the door and she greeted me. She looked haggard, worse than before. "Hi, Janice. Did you come up to my door for something?" I asked. "No, dear. Why?" "I'm sorry. I thought I heard the stairs creaking. I thought maybe you needed something, but then changed your mind." I checked if she needed anything, but she didn't, so I bid her good night. I was certain about what I heard, but if Janice said she didn't come up those stairs, I wasn't about to accuse the old woman. I just tried to shrug it off and ignore it, but it was unsettling. Soon it began to happen a couple times a week. It always happened in the early evening. Finally, I asked my friend Carolyn to come over and hang out and study. I didn't tell her about the stairs. We ordered a pizza, and we sat in the living room just quietly studying. Sure enough, the stairs started to creak. Carolyn looked at me. "Just wait," I said. When the creaking stopped, I walked over to the front door, and I opened it. Carolyn walked over and stood behind me. No one. "What was that?" she asked. I was actually really relieved that someone else had heard it. I launched into my explanation of my landlord's death and the strange sound that started to happen afterwards. Carolyn was a little unnerved, but she was a skeptic. However, I did notice that she refused to come over to my place again after that. One night, I was in my bedroom. I decided to crack open my bedroom window to let some cool air in. This is when things started to get really creepy. It was about 11 o'clock at night, but standing in the backyard, in her bathrobe, was Janice. She just kind of stood there. At first I thought it was odd since it was late, but I thought maybe she just wanted to get some fresh air like me. I shrugged it off and I went to the bathroom. Afterwards, I sat down to watch The Tonight Show. Then, in those days, the David Letterman show came on afterwards. When Letterman ended, it was about 1:30. I returned to my nice cold bedroom. I always loved to sleep in a cold room, underneath a warm blanket. As I went to close the window that I had left open from earlier, to my shock, there was Janice. She had not moved a single step. Janice was about 70 years old, and she had been standing in the backyard for 2.5 hours in the middle of the night. "What the?" I muttered. Working up my nerve, I opened the window and I called out, "Janice! Janice, are you okay? What are you doing?" But there was no response. She didn't even turn to look at me. Sometimes I wish I wasn't a nice guy. With a groan, I threw on my hoodie, I slipped on my sneakers, and I headed outside. When I got to the backyard, there was no one there. There was no sign of Janice anywhere. Damn it. Now where did she go? I turned, and as I went around the corner of the house, Janice was right there in my face. There she stood, all 5 feet 2 inches of horror movie creepiness. I let loose an expletive right into her wrinkled little old face. "Janice, you scared the hell out of me. What are you doing out here?" With blank eyes, Janice looked at me, and she said this, verbatim. "It was Bill, dear. Bill wanted to show me something." There are moments in your life when you lose control of your bodily functions. Usually for me it happens after eating spicy Thai food, but on that particular night I hadn't eaten anything spicy. Luckily I had used the bathroom earlier, but I do recall that I probably peed a little bit in my pajama pants. "Janice, please, you're not making any sense, and you should go back inside." I was shaky, but I tried not to show it. She allowed me to take her wire-thin arm and gently guide her to her door. I helped her inside. She invited me in, but I declined right away and made a beeline back upstairs to change. "It was Bill, dear. Bill wanted to show me something." Even after 2 shots of Jack Daniels, those words echoed in my head. I drifted off into an uneasy sleep that night. I dreamed about Bill Langford. He wanted to fix my toilet. He kept coming up and down the creaky stairs, but I refused to let him in. I told him that the toilet didn't need fixing, but he insisted. In my dream, I locked the door, and then I went to the bathroom. And in the bathroom was Janice Langford. She repeated those words to me in my dream. It was Bill, dear. Bill wanted to show me something. I needed to find a new place to live, I said to myself the next morning. After a couple of days passed, I thought about that night and actually convinced myself that I was overreacting. Sure, Janice was being a bit creepy, but she was just mourning Bill, and things would be fine. What happened next convinced me for the rest of my life to always listen to my first instincts. They're usually right. I had not seen Janice since that night, thankfully. But one night, a couple of weeks after that night, I was sitting on my sofa watching TV. Suddenly, I could hear the creaking stairs. I ignored it, thinking it was going to be like every other time before. But suddenly, there was a soft knocking at the door. I sat up, and I turned my head. Cautiously, I walked to the door, and I peeked outside. To my surprise, it was Janice. I opened the door, and Janice greeted me with a smile. I invited her inside, but she politely declined. She actually looked pretty good. She looked like she had been sleeping better and was much more alert. Her hair was neatly brushed back and her eyes were bright. Janice apologized for the weird night in the backyard. I told her she didn't need to apologize because I understood. She had been going through a lot. Janice smiled and thanked me for understanding. Then she descended those creaky stairs and went back to her place. I smiled, thinking, wow, that was nice of her. She just needed to work through her grief. That night, I slept pretty peacefully with no weird dreams of the Langfords. Then on the next day, I received a call from James Langford, their son. He said he tried to call his mom, but she didn't answer. I explained that I just saw her last night. James told me that that was weird because he had been trying to call her for 2 nights without an answer. I told him that Janice was probably fine and maybe there was just an issue with her phone. I offered to go downstairs and to tell her to call him. James was grateful that I would do that. Without hesitation, I went down those stairs and around the corner. I knocked on the front door. No answer. I waited. Again. I knocked. No answer. I went to the window, but the curtains were closed. There was a slight gap, and I placed both hands on the glass to block out the light so I could see a little bit better. I could see that the room was dark, but I could make out a figure sitting upright in an accent chair. Janice, it's me. James asked me to check up on you. Are you okay? No reply. Again, I called out, but there was no reply. Suddenly, as I squinted to get a clearer look, an eyeball met my eyeball from the other side of the glass. Startled, I stumbled back and I staggered backwards, nearly falling off the porch. Shit. I went upstairs and I called James. I told him what I saw, but I didn't tell him about the eyeball. He told me to get the spare key. He told me that Bill always kept a spare key under the doormat. He pleaded with me to make sure his mom was okay. Okay, I sighed. This is why it doesn't pay to be a nice guy. Reluctantly, I went back downstairs. The next few moments would lead to nightmare fuel and years of therapy. You're welcome, Dr. Goldstein. I lifted the corner of the doormat, and sure enough, there was a matte silver key. I picked it up, I inserted it into the door lock, and then I turned it. There was a brief instance of resistance, then the lock clicked as it released and opened. I gathered my courage and I turned the doorknob. Cautiously, I entered. Janice? I said. I fumbled along the wall for a light switch. I flipped the switch. One switch did nothing, of course. The other switch turned on a dim accent light in the far corner of the room. I could see Janice sitting upright in the chair. Janice, are you okay? James is really worried. I took 2 timid steps and stopped talking. She was still upright, but now that I could see more clearly, Janice was dead. Her face was gaunt and a grayish blue. Her eyes were open and staring off into nothingness. It looked like her pupils started to roll up into her head, then gave up before they completely vanished. Her small mouth was gaping wide open in a grotesque, contorted, and twisted pose. In the days and nights and the years that followed, it was always that mouth that invaded my nightmares first. The thin, darkened lips were cracked and splitting as her body rotted. In my nightmares, those lips would shake and quiver before saying, "It was Bill, dear. Bill wanted to show me something." I slowly backed away. I dared not take my eyes off of that old woman. In a brief instant, I imagined seeing the corpse of Janice Langford, sitting upright and making a mad dash for me. It made me think of the night in the backyard when I turned and was suddenly face to face with her. When Janice did not lunge at me, the irrational fear subsided, and I rushed back to my place. I called James, and frantically I told him what I saw. Then I called 911. In the days that followed, James shared with me that according to the coroner's office, his mother had been dead for at least a week, perhaps a bit longer. My mind raced. If this was true, then who the hell did I talk to the night before I found her body? I packed some clothes and I left that night. My friend Carolyn was nice enough to give me her couch for a couple of weeks. By the time the new semester started, I was in a new place. It wasn't as nice. The water pressure for the shower was awful, but there was no creepy old woman, and I'll take it.